The Hendey Company holds a unique place in the history of American manufacturing. An innovative company that revolutionized the machine tool industry in the 19th century, its lathes are still producing work around the world in the 21st century. More than 40 years after going out of business, newly manufactured parts for Hendey lathes can be found for sale on the internet.
Well, as the Torrington Historical Society, we collect all products made in Torrington, and we had amassed a collection of Hendey machine tools, and we wanted the opportunity to display them, and so we hatched the idea of the Hendey exhibit, and we wanted to display the machine tools in the kind of a setting in which they would have been used, that is a functional machine shop. And we picked a date, the date being the 1930s. The machinery in the shop happens to be a little bit older than that. It was produced around the turn of the century, but in the 1930s it still would have been in use in many machine shops across Connecticut and across the country.
When we first got this demonstration area set up and running, I just stood there and closed my eyes, and it just took me all the way back 50, 55 years. It sounded exactly the same as when I worked in the shop as a young person. I was about 19, 20 years old.
Because everybody respects the Hendey lathe. Like I said, when I made calls in the Midwest, and I said Hendey Machine Company, with open arms, they welcome me in, come in, show what you have.
Well, the rise and fall of the Hendey Machine Company is a microcosm of the dynamics of the American capitalist system. Its rise and fall, it's from being on the cutting edge of innovative and technological brilliance to being bought out and to oblivion, really. It's a sad story.
Hendey was always famous for its quality, and they did sell their equipment worldwide. You can still find pieces like this in India, China, just about any place on the globe that you want to go.
I ran all these different machines while I was there and did all kinds of jobs. So I think that's basically where I learned how to build a machine, was at Hendey's. By the time I got to college, when I was in college and studying engineering, then I had a better idea of what it is we're doing here and what we're supposed to be learning in order to design a machine.
Brothers Henry and Arthur Hendey emigrated to the United States with their family from England. They settled in Waterbury, Connecticut, where the boys attended school. Arthur trained to be a pattern maker, and Henry a machinist.
In 1870, Henry J. Hendey was temporarily out of work as a journeyman toolmaker, and he convinced his brother Arthur to form a partnership and to go into business producing machinery. Hendey, being a machinist, knew that there would always be a demand for high-quality, precision machine tools, and that's what he aimed to make. They started out renting space, but within a year they constructed a small one-story wooden building about the size of a two-car garage on land adjacent to their parents' house. They hired an additional employee. They got a contract for producing wood-turning lathes, which is kind of unusual. It was not something, they didn't make wood-turning tools or woodworking tools as a rule. Metal making machinery was the mainstay of the company. But they started in business with this small shop and this contract. Within a year they had outgrown the space and they were back in rental property once again. And by 1873 they moved into a brand new building that they had just built on Summer Street, 20 feet wide by 40 feet deep, 2 stories high, with a steam engine on the back. And that was the site that they would build their empire on.
We had a major depression which began in 1873 and lasted until 1878. And this is part of that economic business cycle we always had one every 20 years during the 19th century.
Starting out in business, they were short on capital, but long on skill. So Henry Hendey actually made a 3-horsepower steam engine that would be used to power the first machine shop. And the interesting thing is, he got his old job back at the same time that they were starting out in business, and they needed the extra income, so he went back to his 6-day-a-week, 12-hour-a-day job, and in his spare time made the 3-horsepower steam engine that would power their new machine shop on New Litchfield Street. And just as a testament to the quality and workmanship of this little steam engine, it's now in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution.
When all these businesses are failing and going belly up, the Hendey Machine Company is actually expanding. They have their plant size is tripled by 1880. They're adding to their workforce by 20% every year, and they're winning medals.
In 1874, an officer of the Russian Army came to the United States to search out a machine tool manufacturer who could make a small screw-cutting lathe, perfect in every detail. And this was a very exacting commission, and all the machine tool companies that he approached turned down the offer for this contract. Not so with Hendey. He was starting out in business. He welcomed the challenge, actually, of producing this tool for the Russian Army, and it was only 15 inches on center. So they had to design the machine. They had to make patterns for the castings, and then machine all the castings down to their working tolerances, and make all the other accessory parts that would be part of this miniature lathe. But they completed the work satisfactorily, and it was really the beginning of their lathe business, which would eventually become the mainstay of the company.
Well, only 6 years after the company was founded in 1876, they established their first international office in London. And that's very important because already their fame, their reputation for excellence is going to the nations of Europe.
In 1875, Arthur Hendey had to move west due to health problems. Henry continued to run the company on his own.
Of course, starting out in business, it's less risky to design and build on demand. And in the early years, Hendey made a lot of machinery for other Torrington industries, particularly the needle company. The profit margins couldn't have been very great on this, though, because each machine had to be designed, had to have patterns made, and there had to be troubleshooting to make sure that the machine worked properly. And probably only one or two or just a few machines were made per order, so I don't imagine the profit margins were large. It didn't take them long to realize that by producing a line of standardized machines, they could do the research and development once and produce hundreds, if not thousands, of machines, and therefore have a larger profit margin.
In 1892, the Hendey Machine Company filed a patent that would revolutionize the machine tool industry.
Wendell P. Norton invented a mechanism which controlled the speed at which the cutting tool moved along the work in a lathe. This was a particularly useful invention for screw cutting because the speed at which the cutting tool moves determines the number of threads per inch.
When Norton invented the gearbox, he went to several different companies and he was offered maybe $150 or $200 for his patent. And Hendey talked to him and negotiated a deal whereby he could get $50 for each lathe that the Hendey Machine Company would put out. And plus he would be made the plant superintendent for the company in Torrington. So he took that choice and he became a very wealthy man.
Threading was done on all lathes until Hendey came along with the Norton gearbox by changing gears over on the end. If you wanted a 10 thread, you had to look up in your handbook which gears you would need, and you would have to change anywhere from 2 to 4 gears and get them all meshed and locked up and hope that they didn't come out of mesh, because if they did, you'd ruin your piece. Because when this stops turning, you turn a groove on a thread. So Hendey came up with this gearbox. You can do everything from way down a little over 1 thread to the inch or up to 80 threads to the inch without changing a gear. Like right now, I'm cutting 10 threads to the inch. That's 10, which lines up with that line, and 10 is number 2.
Lined up with
and
number
it's
2.
on number 2.
With, they call them a metric transposing gears, you can change one gear back here, and you can match anybody's thread in the world.
Metric?
Sure.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Well, the metric gear you can buy to put in here.
Yeah.
And that changes these. You put another thing over this to show
Okay.
you what you're getting in metric threads.
The big factor was the Norton gearbox and the threading capacity. Also, the accuracy. It was very accurate lathe.
It was a dynamic, innovative technological gain, and it put Hendey in the forefront of American, it's part of the American supremacy in the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. We're way ahead of everybody else. In fact, by 1890, the United States has surpassed Great Britain, Germany, and France as the #1 power in terms of the industrial economy.
The Norton gearbox won a gold medal at the 1892 Chicago Exposition. and then in 1900 won another gold medal at the Paris exposition, which these were essentially trade shows. And these gold medals testified to both the nation and the world that there was some special attributes about the Hendey machine lathe, particularly the gearbox, and it made the users sit up and take notice that there was something worth looking at and something here to purchase. And so it greatly increased the award at the Chicago exposition, greatly increased the domestic sales of the Hendey lathe, and the award at the Paris exposition increased the foreign sales.
Well, in 1893, exactly 20 years after the 1873 recession and depression, we went through another very bad time period. In fact, historians tend to agree that the 1893 depression was the worst before the Great Depression. It lasted for about 4 or 5 years. And again, the unemployment figures were about 20%. And there are businesses, tens of thousands of businesses who are just going bankrupt all over the country. Business slowdowns, recessions, banks collapsing, and everything else. And the Hendey Company is not losing a beat. They're incredibly increasing their sales, and because they have the gearbox, and they have the patent, they have the name for quality and precision and accuracy, they're actually increasing their sales and they're making lots of money.
The machine must, in plan and design, be the concept of a master mind. Its many coordinating and reciprocating parts of the best materials, assembled by artisans laboring in a wholesome environment, inspired by cooperative supervision, artisans whose very pride is expressed in a better product. Henry Hendey.
By the end of the 19th century, Hendey had established their manufacturing process. Technology updates would be implemented, but the basics stayed the same for more than half a century.
The major component of the Hendey lathe or Hendey shaper or Hendey milling machine was cast iron. The whole body of the machine was made out of cast iron. So cast iron was very important. You also needed steel shafting and maybe bronze bushings, but basically you always had all these castings that had to be made and then machined and then assembled. The actual manufacturing of the part then started out over here in the pattern shop, where they made the patterns of what this thing was going to look like. In other words, it's like we're going to make ice cubes, so over here they make the ice cube tray.
So once they have the pattern made, what's the next step?
The next step is to bring the pattern into this building and set it on the floor, which should be dirt, or was dirt in those days. And the pattern, then the cast iron, which came in pigs from whatever source they had for their cast iron, was melted in the cupolas. And then it was poured into the pattern, into the mold. And it was molded into the temperature at which it was poured was 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as it cooled, which took a day or two, you wound up with a lathe bed or a planer base or something like that.
Henry Hendey wanted to control the entire manufacturing process, and the foundry or the iron castings are literally the foundation of the machine tool. They form the base as well as many of the parts of the machine tool, and the accuracy of the machine tool to a large extent is determined by the stability of the castings, and Henry Hendey wanted to be able to control the process in which the castings were made.
And this is where the molten iron was poured into the mold. The foundry buildings, and most of the foundries that I've been in, are dirt. This is because it's easier to handle the cast iron parts. You can drop them on the floor, you can turn them over as you take them out of the molds, knock the sand off them, grind them clean, and paint them this famous gray paint that all castings seem to get painted.
A casting will change over time, and to get most of the changes out of the way, they would store them outside in the weather for 6 months to a year. And then they would take them in and rough machine them all over, then do the finish machining, and from then on, for another 100 years, it wouldn't move.
Every day at 2:30 or 3 o'clock, there was a huge stack on the top of the foundry building. And at that time, this huge cloud of smoke and sparks, looked like 4th of July every day here, came pouring out of this stack. And because our house was that way and the wind always blew this way, all that soot always wound up in our house. So at 2:30, my mother had to go running out and get in all the laundry and the bed sheets, otherwise you had to sleep on bed sheets covered with Hendey soot.
So now this is the planer building?
Yes, this is what they called the planer bay. What was in here was a series of planers, which they're big tables, and the parts move back and forth underneath a tool that sits on a crosshead. And the parts are brought in from the foundry, brought into here. They're scribed by the layout men so that the planers know where to make the cuts.
We all had to go to all different departments, and so some would, for example, be in a shaper department for first, and some would be in the lathe department first, some in grinding first, so it didn't matter which operation you learned first. You were going to learn them all anyway. But the one that everybody disliked the most was in the planer department, because here you've got a whole room that's probably over 100 feet long, and machines up and down both sides cutting cast iron. And anyone who has worked with cast iron knows that it's extremely dirty job. There's very fine dust in the air all the time. It doesn't make nice chips like steel does. It makes powder. And it's, especially in the summer, it gets very messy. I'd go home at night, take a shower, and get as clean as I could, and then in the morning I wake up, my pillow would be rusty from the cast iron dust and the perspiration. And this is something everybody had to contend with. We felt, when we come out of there, we felt like coal miners look when they come out of the mine. We didn't look quite that bad, but we felt like it.
Then after it was done here in the planer bay, it went across to the machine shop, and that's where they did the boring and drilling, threading the holes in the castings, and all that work that was done in the machine shop, and then from there, of course, to the final assembly. This was the machine shop here. Right. That's where the boring mills and the drill presses, milling machines, and that kind of stuff are all in here.
As you got near the end of your apprenticeship, you got to work in the assembly department, where all these finished parts now are assembled. And then you really realize why it was so important there to get all your dimensions exactly right, so the parts fit together. Some parts had to fit so closely that you had to select them and do hand fitting to make them exactly right, but it was important that they come pretty nearly right to the assembly operation. And then once the machine was all assembled, inspected, and passed, the freight cars came right into the assembly room, and the big crane just took them from where you would assemble them, put them right in the freight car, and off they went.
The administration building was where all the offices were that were involved in the administration of the company. The president's office was there, and other bigwigs. Also the purchasing department, the payroll department, and that was the most, as far as we were concerned, that's the most important department in the whole shop, because on Thursday you expected to get that envelope with your money in it, because they paid in cash.
The technology of the assembly line was stable and functioning smoothly, but the early 20th century saw great social changes. Workers exerted more influence on the Hendey business.
My grandfather worked here at Hendey's for 51 years. He was working at Eagle Bicycle Company, which later became Full Manufacturing. It's up on by the Torrington company, and they made bicycles. And his job was making bicycle spokes. And he decided that he'd rather do something better than make bicycle spokes. So he came down to Hendey's. And he also came because he got a big raise. He went from 5 cents an hour to 7.5 cents. So he got a 50% raise to come to work at Hendey's. So he came here in 1902 and stayed here right till the end.
The first labor unrest occurred in 1903 when the workers petitioned the Hendey Machine Company for a reduction in their Saturday hours. Now, they were used to working 10 hours a day on Saturday, and the workers wanted to have a 5-hour day on Saturday. And basically, that's what the solution was. They were working during the week from 7 a.m. in the morning to noontime, and then from 1 o'clock to 6 p.m. But on Saturdays during June, July, and August, they would work 5 hours a day. So they got paid for 60 hours and worked 55 hours a week.
A man who knew what he wanted, Mr. Hendey was a disciplinarian, and he didn't want to get caught making bad parts.
Henry Hendey died in December of 1906, and at that time he was still president of the Hendey Machine Tool Company. He had been sick for some time, so I imagine some of the day-to-day duties of running the company had fallen to the other officers. The board of directors elected Frederick F. Fusnich to succeed Henry J. Hendey as the president of the company. Frederick Fusnich had been treasurer of the company for many decades and knew the business very well. He had been a salesman previously to becoming treasurer. He knew all about the production and the economics of the company, certainly. Henry Hendey was laid to rest on December 12th, 1906. And on the day of the funeral, of course, the factory was closed for the day in tribute to their beloved president. The 600 employees of the company assembled en masse outside of the factory and marched a couple of short blocks to Hendey's house where he was laid in rest to pay their respects to their president. And then when Hendey's body was taken to Trinity Church for the funeral, of course the 600 followed in procession. I doubt that they all could get into the church. I don't think it holds that many people. But certainly this mass march both to the house and to the church is certainly a testament to the high esteem in which Hendey was held by the men of the factory. Well, the first layoffs in the Hendey Machine Company were in 1912. And the official explanation was that there was actually a business slowdown, and there was a mild recession right before World War I in 1914. And it was happening everywhere. All machine companies were under the same bad years and bad profits. And to save money, they had to lay off 50 men, so there would be enough work, 55 hours a week, for the rest of the workforce.
The Hendey Company lathes were the standard for the military and their contractors, so their sales became linked to the rise and fall of the war economy.
Well, the first strike happens in 1915 in September, and the union was the International Association of Machinists, which was not recognized by the Hendey management. And basically, it was over a very radical idea that had been tossed around for many, many years called an 8-hour day. The workers wanted an 8-hour day. They were accustomed to working 10. They wanted a 15% wage hike, and they also wanted time and a half for overtime. And in 1915, it was the beginning of World War I, and the Hendey Machine Company was making lots of money. And the workers wanted their share of the pie, their slice of the pie, too.
900 men, practically the entire workforce, walked out at 8 a.m. September 4th after Charles Alvord, general manager, refused to consider the petition. Many machinists were seen carrying their tool chests. 500 men attended a meeting at City Hall, and the committee had representatives from all departments. The Torrington Evening Register.
Well, in the event of a strike, even today, when they call a strike, the machinists, the tool makers, anybody that has their own tools, take the tools out with them, because they probably won't stay on the picket line too long. They're going to look for another job, because they have the skills to get another job, where a machine operator might not find another job right away. So you see them walking out with their toolboxes, that meant the strike was really on.
In order to go shopping downtown, they had to walk by Hendey's gate out here. And my grandmother and my mother would be coming back from shopping, and the strikers would be out there carrying their signs and walking back and forth, and then they'd see my grandmother and they'd say, "There goes Charlie Budo, the scab's wife." So that's what they call my grandmother, the scab's wife. My mother wasn't too happy about that, but what are you going to do?
We have presented our proposal. The company will make advances to individuals on merit, confident that every man of sober thought well knows that he will be well and fairly treated. If you are not ready to accept these conditions wholly and heartily, do not come back. We don't want any half-hearted allegiance. Wendell P. Norton, Superintendent.
The Hendey Company was so important that federal mediators came up and talked to the people, and the final results were, shockingly, not an 8-hour day, but they wound up with having a 9-hour day, 6 days a week. So the work week would be 54 hours. The workers got their 15% wage hike, and they also got time and a half for their work.
Torrington should be complimented upon the citizenship shown in the conduct of the Hendey strike without violence or disorders. I believe that the men will return to their work with that same spirit of cooperation and loyalty that previously characterized their attitude toward the Hendey Company. James Smith, Federal Mediator.
Well, the machine tool industry was prone to times of boom and bust depending upon the economy. And of course, the economy booms during war times when defense production shoots up. And that happened in World War I, it happened in World War II, and Hendey followed a pattern that was typical of the machine tool industry in general. They made about 1,500 per year during the World War I years, and their production dropped precipitously thereafter. And the same thing happened in World War II. Production shot up in the early 40s. By 1942, they were producing 1,900 lathes per year. Actually, not much more than they produced during World War I. But the same thing happened after World War II. The production fell off dramatically. This was a parade, a welcome home parade, following the armistice that ended World War I. And it was welcoming home Company M to Torrington after the war. And what is most striking to me when viewing the film is the ethnic diversity in Torrington. You can look at the immigration statistics and realize that there was a flood of immigrants into Torrington at the turn of the century, and the population was doubling every decade, largely due to immigration. But when you look at the faces in the crowd, you realize that that this is true. There really is a strong ethnic community here in Torrington. It also makes me think that the hat industry was doing gangbusters in Danbury.
No, in the 20s they went down pretty much. I have no idea of how many people actually were there, but I know that my grandfather didn't work there for 2 years, did he, in 1920 and 1921.
And then from 1922 to 1929, the gross national product went up about 40%, and it was a big economic boom, and it was a cornucopia of consumer goods, from automobiles to radios to refrigerators, washing machines. All kinds of new consumer items were appearing on the American scene.
The Hendey Company had always run their own apprenticeship program to train workmen for their needs. In 1923, it became part of public education.
In 1923, the state of Connecticut reorganized the apprenticeship program for machinists, and the program was reorganized to include the state trade schools, who would thereafter play a role in the education of the machinists. What they wanted to do was to increase the academic training of the machinists. Before that time, the work was largely factory work, the skilled work that the machinists needed to know. But they wanted to make the machinist more academically trained, to give him a broader base of knowledge so that he could respond more quickly to changes in the workplace.
The best part about serving apprenticeship in a Hendey Machine Company was that it was such a wide variety of work experience. And anywhere you went to look for a job, if you told them you served your apprenticeship in Hendey's, then, well, you were in. Just talk about how much you're going to pay you now.
The Hendey apprenticeship program, even before the 20s, was one of the best apprenticeship programs in the country. People came from all over the country to apprentice at the Hendey machine tool company, not necessarily with the intention of working there, but with the intention of becoming a machinist. Many, of course, did stay and work at the company.
I was there 6 months and I was getting the same pay as the people who were there 20 years, so The quality of my work was up to what they wanted, and as well as the quantity.
At the lowest point of the Great Depression, Hendey discovered that their treasurer, Sterry Hunt Childs, had embezzled money during the construction of a new final assembly building. It was another blow to the company as it struggled to stay in business.
Well, the Great Depression that begins with the collapse of the stock market on October 29, 1929, brings in the Great Depression, which lasts from 1929 to 1941, and the highest rates of unemployment, 25% across the country. Connecticut is very hard hit. There's about probably 150,000 people who are jobless in Connecticut. And even this time it hits the Hendey Corporation. And they, in the late 1920s, when times were still good, they were cranking out about 500 lathes per year, as late as 1927. And then in the worst year of the Depression, 1932, that number went from 500 lathes to 10. So even during the Great Depression, even the Hendey Machine Company is taking it on the chin too.
I can remember sometime during the 30s, and I can't be positive, but I'm pretty sure that my grandfather had like a labor pool of guys that could work there, and they would come down to our house, and then he'd pick out whoever was going to work for the day. And the rest went home, I guess. And as far as my grandfather, as far as I know, my grandfather worked every day during the 1930s. I don't ever remember him being home.
During the 1930s, organized labor made a dramatic comeback. During the 1920s, it was hard times. And I think there were only about 3 million people, workers in the country who belonged to unions. And that number is going to at least quadruple by 1940. And even women and African Americans whose numbers belonging to the unions were always very, very low are going to be quadrupling their membership too. And what happens in 1937 is that the Hendey Company is going to be recognizing the United Auto Workers.
Uncle Marcel at that time was president of the unions. Uncle Marcel lived further up Litchfield Street than we did. So when my grandfather came out of the house and came down Litchfield Street, Uncle Marcel would come out of his house, which was on the same side of the street, and cross over and walk down the other side. So he didn't have to walk on the same side of the street as my grandfather. And this was his brother-in-law. So you can see how the union affected the personal lives of the people here. And I remember for years my grandfather always said, "Oh, that Marcel, nothing but a communist." And Marcel would say, "Your grandfather's a good guy, except he's a fascist." And that's how they felt.
In 1941, just a couple of months before Pearl Harbor, the entire Hendey workforce walked off the job due to a labor dispute. The Defense Mediation Board sent a telegram to the employees urging them to go back to work, that it was their patriotic duty to return to work on the defense contracts, which were very vital at that time and of course would become even more vital after Pearl Harbor.
And these men are rising to the cause of liberty, working hand in hand with one idea in their drive for victory. All departments in the factory are busy as can be. So we'll lick those Axis monsters from far across the sea.
Like most U.S. industries, women were welcomed into the workforce during World War II to fill jobs formerly held by men who were off in the armed forces. At Hendey, it was the same as in other industries. Women took their place on the production floor. But after the war, men returned to the workforce.
Well, right after World War II, throughout the entire country, there was a lot of labor unrest. As soon as the President Truman and the Congress had lifted the price controls, there was runaway inflation, and workers in all industries were trying to get big pay hikes to battle the new inflation. And the Hendey people were no different. And in fact, they actually were upset because in 1946 they were promised a new type of piece rate plan where they really weren't making that much more money. And so, to make a long story short, there was a strike, And what they want is a 15% wage hike. They want a new piece rate plan. And they finally get a 12.5% increase. And they do get that new piece rate plan that they wanted at the same time.
Well, I grew up on a farm over in Cornwall, Connecticut, but I didn't like animals. I didn't like the vegetable garden, pulling weeds, but I liked the machinery. And so when I got out of high school, it was 1941, and the government was running a special night school to learn to run machine tools at the Torrington trade school, or the state trade school, but it was on South Main Street. And it was a night course, so you went for 5 weeks at night. Actually, you're basically learning how to run the lathe, the shapers, the milling machine, and do some handwork besides. And then you're looking for a job in a defense factory. And before I finished the course, I was doing pretty good, so I got a call from Hendey Machine Company to come up there and interview for a job. So they hired me before I even finished the 5-week course. I had made it in my mind I wanted to stick with the machinery the rest of my life.
I'm in a shop on the shaper department with my coveralls on, a duster or whatever I had on. And Dave Ayer, it was about August, well, the foreman says, the big boy wants to see you. So I walked in with my work clothes on, and I sat in this beautiful office. I walked in this beautiful office, a big, beautiful desk, and there was old Dave Ayer sitting in that big chair. So he said, sit down, Paul. He said, call me Paul. And we'd like to have you consider if you'd like to be a salesman for us out there. So I was a little bit shocked, asking me. And so I don't know if I mentioned it before, I said, well, I'd like to think about it. And with his Scottish brogue, I can't imitate him, but he came out and he said, well, young man, he says, you think about it, and tomorrow morning you have the answer. I think after the war, I was the first salesman pulled out of the shop.
So my mother went to my grandfather and said that John's got to have a job where he can make some money. You think you could get him a job at Hendey's? So I went down to see Mr. Harry Fusnich, who was the personnel director. So Mr. Fusnich says, well, all right, Charlie, I guess you can bring him in here. Let me talk to him. I went into Mr. Fusnich's office, and he was sitting there behind his desk with his jacket off. He had his vest on and a big wad of chewing tobacco in his mouth, and he spit a big wad in a spittoon there, and he said, so you want a job? I said, yes, sir. He said, your grandfather says you're going to come here and work. I said, yes, sir. And he told my grandfather later he never heard anybody use the word sir so many times in a single sentence, because I learned that at the Merchant Marine Academy. So he said, well, based on the fact this kid can say sir, we'll give him a job. And I was making $1.15 plus time and a half for everything after 40 hours. So I was making about $85 a week. Big money in those days, more than my father made, and he was supporting 5 of us.
A bid of $2 million for all the stock of the Hendey Machine Company has been made by Carling's Red Cap Distributors, whose sole stockholder is Frederick W. Richmond. Mr. Richmond said the listing of himself as sole stockholder is a technicality, and there are other people involved in the deal, although he declined to name them. He told the Republican that he and his associates intend to keep present management, including President Ayer, as well as all employees, and plan to expand the scope of the plant. Waterbury Republican, September 26, 1952.
Well, I said, they're a brewing company. He says, no, it's a holding company. Frederick W. Richmond bought it out.
Frederick Richmond bought the Hendey Machine Tool Company in 1952, and his intentions at that time were unclear. Publicly, he stated that he wanted to reinvest in the company. He wanted to diversify their product line, which was a problem. He wanted to modernize their products somewhat, which was another problem that the company was trying to deal with.
Hendey is a fine, well-known name in the machine tool business, and I wish to keep it that way. I intend to create the biggest machine tool company in the country. Frederick Richmond.
Privately, I don't think he ever had that intention, because production fell off month by month. There was no reinvestment in the company, and workers were laid off. And the last year, 1953 and early 1954, the company was pretty much on life support. And eventually all the employees were laid off, and in 1954 there was the final dismantling of the company.
I think it's because they weren't innovative enough. For example, the hardened lathe beds, which outlasted the old ones many times, but Hendey's were not the first ones to do that. They sort of waited until everybody else had them, and then they try to play catch-up, and that doesn't work. Even today, anything, if you're not in the lead, you're just following behind, well, it's you're following behind all the time.
Now, I thought it was because of the union, so I believed it for all these years, and recently I found out that wasn't true. It was actually a product of stock manipulation and other things that did the company in.
I came back here in '54 when Hendey started folding up, because I got disturbed what I was hearing out in Chicago, who bought out the Hendey Machine Company.
A 1954 article in Time magazine referred to Frederick Richmond as a tycoon. He himself referred to himself as a venture capitalist. Other people referred to him as a speculator in companies. I think today we would probably call him a corporate raider. He was a businessman who looked to buy companies that were valued at less than the sum value of their assets. He would buy them and have no qualms about selling off whatever assets were necessary to make a profit, even if it meant the entire company.
Well, the liquidators like Frederick W. Richmond, they prefer to work in a setting whereby there's a strong bull market, like the 1950s, early 50s, 1954, and where there's a nice availability of risk capital, and also where there are tax laws which can protect all their machinations, all that they're doing. And all those set of circumstances were happening in the 1950s.
They had work piled up to the ceiling when I left there in Labor Day weekend in 1953 to go back to school rather, at the University of Connecticut for my final year.
The company was not losing money when it was closed down in 1954. In fact, there was $1 million in orders.
Like, I know what we had in Chicago. We had several $100,000. Now, I don't know what the rest of the offices had.
Frederick Richmond bought the Hendey Machine Tool Company for $2 million. When he dismantled the company in 1954, the auction flyer stated that it was, the auction was valued at $3.5 million. So he probably made a significant amount of money on just selling the machines and fixtures in the factory. He also sold the land and buildings to the American Brass Company, which operated a huge plant just basically across Summer Street. And he sold the line of Hendey machine tools, the lathes and shapers, to Barbara Coleman of Rockford, Illinois, who continued to produce Hendey lathes and shapers for many years thereafter.
My grandfather never smiled much after Hendey closed. I never saw him smile after that. He had lost his life's work. I mean, he had no intention of going home. He was 76 years old, but he was no way he was going to go home. He just stayed here right till the day he died. And so when Hendey's closed and he had to come home, he was not a very happy man, and couldn't get him to smile. Not at all.
To be honest with you, I hate to say it, Hendey needed money. And I may be wrong, But I think it could have been saved, because there was money in Torrington. There was probably quite a bit of money in Torrington. They could have bought that. But the stockholders, I think, were getting shaky. So, I don't know if I mentioned before, I don't blame Ayer. He was in a predicament. And I think the stockholders want to get out.
The Hendey Machine Company was an early sign of the future for large manufacturing companies in Connecticut and throughout the Northeast. The companies and workers were becoming obsolete.
The whole debacle of the sale of the Hendey Corporation is pretty sad because it also reflects a dynamic that historians have been arguing about for many, many decades in American capitalism, whether that these people, these entrepreneurs, these liquidators, these tycoons, are they captains of industry, which is the nice term, or are they robber barons? And certainly in the American capitalist system, anybody has the right to buy a company and to do anything he wants, whether they want to liquidate the assets, they want to just leave the shell, sell the shell, leave, whatever they want to do, it's their right. But other people say, no, it's people before profits.
The Hendey Company, which a generation ago was held in high esteem throughout the industrial world as a leader in the machine tool trade, is a corpse whose outer shell is being sold to another industry. The real tragedy is not so much the ignominious conditions surrounding the termination of a once prominent industry, but rather the fate which has befallen many faithful workers who have given the greater part of their lives in the service of the company. Art Parrott, Waterbury Republican.
All of these machinists at the Hendey Company were thrown out of work in 1953 and 1954. We're probably talking about maybe 1,000 employees flooding the job market. The industries in Torrington couldn't absorb them. Some of them began commuting to other machine shops out of Torrington, and others were getting on in years and just decided to give up their work. And we've heard a lot of stories about those older workers suffering from depression, being out of work.
Well, the Connecticut workforce has dramatically changed, especially since the 1980s. Now, historians and economists are talking about the post-high-tech industrial revolution, computers, and now more and more Americans are earning their living through the service sector. We're not a manufacturing country as much as we used to be. We are also into healthcare, education, entertainment, sales, and the like.
Today, almost 50 years after Hendey's closing, Able Machine Tool Company produces parts and manuals for Hendey users around the world.
On an annual basis, the Torrington Historical Society receives several requests for particularly lathe operators' manuals, which indicates to us that there's a lot of interest out there still in the Hendey lathe. These are people that are still using this machine tool, in some cases 100 years after it was first manufactured, and it still can produce precision products.
Hendey's was a very important part of the family life because there it was. All the buildings, the smoke pouring out, the steam coming out, and everything else. So we saw it all the time. I mean, when I woke up in the morning and I put my shade up in the back of my bedroom and looked out the window to see what the day was like, there was Hendey's right out the back window of our house. So it was there, we knew it was there. My grandfather was up every morning going to work there. Looked out the window when I was eating my breakfast, watching the other men come walking down the street and heading into Hendey's. So Hendey's was there and it was a big part of our life.